Welcome to Whispers of Crime. Today we're looking at a story that is just. It's one of the most disturbing and frankly persistent crises in American crime.
It really is. We're talking about the unsolved murders of dozens of women in Chicago, a crisis that spans nearly a quarter of a century.
And the sources we have, investigative reports, official task force findings, even computational data analysis, they all seem to be pointing in one direction.
They do. Our mission here is to cut through all the noise, all the years of denial, to really understand two things. First, how did the system fail these women so catastrophically?
And second, what is the hard data actually telling us about who did this? The things the police seem to have missed for decades.
Exactly, because the story isn't just about a monster, or even multiple monsters. It's about a system that allowed them to hunt.
51 women, 24 years.
Yeah.
And still, zero real answers.
In Chicago, it felt like a silent predator was just snapping necks and vanishing. I mean, bodies were left in snowbanks, abandoned buildings, alleys, even garbage bins, treated like refuse.
And the official police line for years was that these were just random, unconnected deaths.
They were wrong. So wrong.
How does a crisis of this magnitude, 51 women, how does that stay hidden for so long? What does that say about the value placed on these lives?
That's the core question, isn't it? The truth only came out because of a machine. In 2018, a data algorithm exposed the nightmare.
This was the Murder Accountability Project, MAP.
That's right, led by Thomas Hargrove. They ran an algorithm that grouped 51 of these strangulation cases together with a terrifying similarity rate of 94%.
94%.
The conclusion was stark. Coincidence is mathematically impossible. This is the work of serial killers, plural.
And yet, decades of DNA evidence has led nowhere. There's a task force now that's been accused of hiding the truth. We even have a confessed maniac from another state claiming the real count is even higher.
So the question remains, who is strangling Chicago? And maybe more importantly, why haven't they been caught?
Follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime.
Let's start at the beginning of this modern cluster. To really set the scope, we have to understand the official designation. This is the Chicago Strangler crisis, spanning from 2001 to the present day.
And it's still considered an active, unsolved serial murder crisis.
Very much so. The starting point that the MAP analysis used was January 4th, 2001.
Right, that was with the discovery of Angela Ford.
Angela Ford, age 32, a black woman. Her body was discovered, and she became the first official entry in this data set of 51 unsolved strangulations between 2001 and 2018.
But 51 is really just the baseline, isn't it? The number everyone agrees on? The true number could be much higher.
The estimates go up to 75, even more. 51 is just the number that fits the tightest statistical model. The reality on the ground suggests a much broader problem.
Let's talk about the victim profile, because this is where the institutional bias you mentioned, the neglect, it just becomes brutally clear.
It's hauntingly specific. The victims are overwhelmingly black women. Over 95% of this confirmed group.
And the age range is quite wide.
It is, from 18 to 58, which tells you something important. The killer wasn't targeting a specific age. He was targeting a specific vulnerability.
And law enforcement categorized many of these women as high risk.
They did. That was the official label. It often meant they had histories of sex work or were struggling with addiction, with illegal drug use.
And when a label like high risk gets attached to a victim, it can.
Oh.
Well, it can change the entire direction of an investigation, can't it?
It absolutely can. It almost functions as an excuse for a reduced investigative effort. It becomes a kind of systemic victim blaming.
The assumption is that their lifestyle led to their death,
Yeah.
not a calculated predator.
Precisely. And that single assumption, that systemic bias, is really the bedrock that this whole crisis was built on. It allowed the pattern to continue undetected for years.
Beyond the victims themselves, the consistency in the method, the MO, is what the algorithm really locked onto.
Yes. The cause of death in almost every single case was strangulation or asphyxiation. It's a very physical, very intimate, and frankly, a very personal way to kill.
And then there's the disposal of the bodies, the handling of victims after death.
That was also disturbingly consistent. Victims were often partially or even fully stripped of their clothing, and then they were deliberately disposed of in what we call dump sites.
And these weren't, carefully hidden graves out in the woods.
Not at all. These were abandoned buildings, neglected city alleys, public garbage bins, or sometimes just left in a snowdrift on the side of a road.
Leaving a body in a garbage bin. That sends a message.
It sends a very powerful message. It's an act of profound dehumanization. And it shows an arrogance from the killer, a belief that nobody will look too closely, that nobody will care enough to connect the dots.
That's a belief that, for almost 2 decades, turned out to be tragically correct.
And the families felt that disregard acutely. You have that quote from Ricardo Holyfield. His cousin Renee Holyfield was found in a garbage bin in 2018.
Yeah, I remember this. He said, people keep dismissing us because of these women's backgrounds.
He was basically saying out loud what the data was showing. The police's actions or inactions, they mirrored the killer's contempt. The killer knew the system undervalued these lives, and he used that bias as a shield.
And geographically, this was all happening in a very concentrated area.
Very. The violence was heavily focused in specific police districts on the south and west sides of Chicago.
Oh.
Neighborhoods like Washington Park and Garfield Park show up again and again.
So what does that tell you, that concentration?
It's a huge clue. It strongly suggests the killer or killers are local. They're comfortable there. They know the streets. They know the abandoned buildings. They know where the cameras aren't. They're not outsiders driving through randomly. They are operating in their own territory.
So to sum up this first part, we have a clear pattern. A specific group of women being targeted, killed the same way, dumped with contempt in the same few neighborhoods.
Exactly. And the most damning part is that Chicago had seen this exact pattern before. The city should have known. Which brings us to the 1990s.
Right, because the term Chicago Strangler isn't really about one person. It's about a systemic problem that has been going on for a very, very long time.
If you want to understand how the city allowed 51 more women to be killed after 2001, you have to look at how they failed to learn the lessons of the 1990s.
The historical context is it's essential. It proves that Chicago's South Side was already a place where multiple serial killers could hunt at the same time.
Preying on the exact same group of women, and they were doing it without being immediately detected. It set a horrible precedent. It's like the capture of one killer just opened up territory for the next one.
So let's talk about some of those precursors, starting with Hubert Geralds Jr.
Hubert Geralds Jr., sometimes called the Englewood Strangler, he was active from 1994 to 1995. He was ultimately convicted of killing 5 women in the Englewood neighborhood.
And his victims fit the profile perfectly.
To a T. All of them were female sex workers, all strangled, and he used a very specific method, something investigators called the guardian angel chokehold.
Let's stop there for a second. A specific chokehold with a name. That's not random.
Not at all. It implies a degree of practice, maybe even training. It's a controlled restraint method. It takes some technical skill. It's often associated with people who might have had combat training, security training, something like that.
So even back in the 90s, this detail hints at a killer who isn't just a disorganized, impulsive person.
Right. And it lends some historical weight to those community rumors that we'll get into later about the killer possibly having a law enforcement background.
In Gerald's case, it also exposed a massive investigative flaw.
A critical one. Gerald's was actually wrongfully convicted of a 6th murder, the murder of a woman named Rhonda King.
How did that happen?
It was based on a coerced confession, which was unfortunately quite common in that era. The police wanted to clear the case. They had a known killer in custody, so they pushed for a confession.
But he didn't do it.
He didn't. That conviction was later overturned, and you know why? Because another serial killer, Andre Crawford, confessed to murdering Rhonda King. And this time, DNA evidence proved Crawford was the one who did it.
Wait, so while the police were focused on Gerald's coercing a false confession,
the real killer, Andre Crawford, was still out there, operating in the exact same neighborhood.
That is unbelievable. So we have confirmed 2 serial killers active at the same time in the same part of Chicago.
Yes. Gerald's was active from 94 to 95. Andre Crawford killed 11 women between 1993 and 1999. Their activity overlapped for at least 2 years. Same method strangulation, same victim type, same few square miles. And investigators completely missed it at the time.
That one fact, that overlap, that proves the multi-perpetrator pattern was already established in the 90s.
Irrefutably. And that failure alone should have triggered a complete overhaul of how strangulation cases were investigated, long before Angela Ford was found in 2001.
But it didn't, and there were even more killers.
The problem was even bigger. You had Gregory Klepper, who was active from 1991 to 1996. Klepper was a whole other level of confusion for the police.
He confessed to a staggering number of murders, right?
He did. He initially confessed to killing nearly 40 women. He even drew maps for the investigators, showing them where he supposedly left the bodies.
40 victims. I mean, was that credible?
It turned out to be highly unreliable. It was controversial. In the end, Klepper was only convicted of one murder, Patricia Scott's, in 2001.
So what happened to the other 39 confessions?
DNA testing eventually excluded him from at least 14 of the cases he confessed to. It just highlights another huge problem from that era: the over-reliance on confessions, which were sometimes coerced or given by people who were not in a reliable state of mind.
It sounds like the focus was just on closing cases, getting a name on a file, not on meticulously connecting the evidence to find the truth.
That's a very good way to put it. And the final piece of this 90s puzzle, the one that serves as the direct bridge to the 21st century crisis, is a man named Kevin Taylor.
Kevin Taylor.
He killed 4 women during the summer of 2001.
The exact moment. The summer of 2001 is precisely when this huge, unsolved cluster officially begins with Angela Ford's death.
Exactly. And Taylor's MO is identical to the unsolved cases we're talking about: strangulation, quick disposal in alleys, garbage cans, abandoned houses on the south side.
So the police solved Taylor's 4 murders, but the other killings just kept happening.
And that's the proof. The fact that they caught Taylor, but the body count for these unsolved cases started climbing immediately after, proves that multiple independent sprees were active in 2001. The violence didn't stop when Taylor was arrested. It just transitioned to predators who were more forensically aware, or maybe just luckier.
So if the system couldn't even tell the difference between 3 killers operating at the same time in the 90s, the failure was just baked in. How could they possibly have kept track when the number of victims surged past 50 after 2001?
They couldn't. The negligence created what was essentially a zero-risk hunting ground.
And it took nearly 2 decades for anyone to really blow the whistle on it.
The city's denial of this crisis was only shattered in 2018. And it wasn't shattered by a detective, it was shattered by Thomas Hargrove and the Murder Accountability Project. Their findings forced the issue into the open.
Because traditional police work had just failed to connect the dots.
Yeah.
For 20 years.
It had. So let's talk about what MAP's algorithm was actually looking for that the human detectives were missing.
It's basically a pattern-finding machine for murder.
That's a great way to describe it. It sorts all of a city's unsolved homicides by 3 key things: the density of location, consistency in the victim profile, and consistency in the killing method.
And it specifically looks for clusters where the clearance rate, the rate of solved cases, is unusually low.
Exactly. In Chicago, the overall homicide clearance rate was, over 60%. But for this specific group of strangulations, it was hovering near 0%. That huge statistical gap is the classic signature of a serial offender at work.
Let's go back to the timeline of this main cluster from 2001 onwards. There were definite peaks in activity.
The activity was relentless. The first major wave really confirmed the problem. It was in the early 2000s, mostly from 2001 through 2004. Then after things got a bit quieter, we saw a really disturbing resurgence between 2017 and 2018.
Right. That second wave included victims like Diamond Turner in 2017 and then Valerie Jackson and Rio Holyfield in 2018.
It shows that the crisis never really went away. It just entered periods of lower visibility. The threat was always there.
And the pace of the killings during that initial surge. Let's look at the year 2003 specifically. Just unsettling.
The intensity in 2003 alone is alarming. 8 women, all fitting this profile, were found murdered in just that one year.
But it's more than just the number. It's the timing. There's this phenomenon of double discoveries.
This is a crucial piece of the analysis. It argues so powerfully for a shared pattern. On 2 separate occasions in 2003, 2 victims were discovered on the exact same day.
Give us the specifics on those.
Okay, so on May 20th, 2003, the bodies of Linda Green, who was 42, and Tarika Jones, who was 30, were both discovered. Then, just 5 months later, on October 15, 2003, it happened again. 2 more victims found on the same day: Latricia Hall, 21, and Lucy Sett Thomas, 38.
Finding 2 victims on the same day like that, that's not a coincidence. That implies a level of calculation. This isn't just random opportunistic violence.
No, it's not. It suggests one of 2 things, and they're both highly predatory. Either you have a single killer who is disposing of multiple victims at once, or, and this is maybe more likely given the multi-killer theory, the disposal area itself is a known, safe dumping ground.
A spot that multiple predators know they can use without being detected.
Exactly. Either way, the highly localized activity confirms that the killers share geographic knowledge and preferences. They know the safe spots.
And what about the killer's range? Did the MAP analysis suggest someone on foot or someone with a vehicle?
It pointed to a very pronounced geographic cluster running along South Indiana Avenue, especially in the Bronzeville neighborhood. Hargrove's analysis suggests this means the killer is mobile, almost certainly driving.
And they possess deep local knowledge of the streets.
Profound local knowledge. They know how to get around, how to hunt across wider areas, and how to use those neglected zones for a quick disposal. This isn't a killer who's just confined to a single city block.
So the data gives us this incredibly clear picture. Same victims, same MO, same disposal style, all in a tight geographic area, carried out by a predator who knows the streets and has a car.
And for the CPD to call these unconnected incidents for so many years, it just completely defies the math. MAP's whole point is that the probability of 51 random unconnected men all independently choosing the exact same victim, method, and disposal site in the same small area over 2 decades is basically zero.
The data proves it's serial. The only question left was about the DNA.
Right. The DNA was supposed to be the key to identifying the specific individuals responsible.
Don't forget to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime. Like, share this episode with others who might have information about this case and help. Also, comment your suggestions below. Drop your positive review and rating.
So after all the public pressure from MAP's report, the Chicago Police Department was basically forced to launch a new review of these 51 cases. They were looking specifically for DNA links.
This was the moment that forensic science was supposed to finally crack the case.
It was supposed to, but they hit a wall almost immediately. And the first problem was the evidence itself.
What do you mean? What were the limitations?
The main limitation was just the lack of usable evidence from the original crime scenes. Out of those 51 cases they were reviewing, the CPD only managed to get a viable male DNA profile from about 18 to 21 of them.
18 to 21 out of 51. That recovery rate is shockingly low.
It's profoundly low.
I mean, we're talking about strangulation. It's one of the most hands-on physical contact crimes there is. You would expect DNA to be present.
You absolutely would. Just for context, in most homicide cases, even cold cases involving a contact crime like this, you'd expect a successful DNA extraction rate of 50, 60, maybe 70%.
So a rate of less than 50% points to a massive failure at the beginning of the investigation.
It points to a failure of evidence collection so fundamental that it suggests these crime scenes were just not processed properly from the start. If a body is left in an alley or a garbage bin, exposed to the elements for days or weeks, the chance of recovering good DNA just plummets.
And if that evidence wasn't collected or preserved correctly back in 2003, there's not much that even the best modern technology can do about it now.
Exactly. They were facing a forensic wall that was built 20 years ago.
Okay, so they had their 21 samples. They ran them through CODIAS, the FBI's national DNA database.
Yeah.
What did they find?
The results were, well, they were conclusive in how fragmented they were. And the CPD used this fragmentation to support their original narrative.
What were the two main findings?
First, none of the 21 samples matched each other. There was no single DNA profile that linked all 21 cases together.
Okay, so no single superkiller was responsible for all of them.
Correct. And second, none of the 21 samples matched any known criminal profile that was already in the CODIS database.
So the CPD took this and said, see? They're all different men. They're unconnected crimes. There is no single Chicago Strangler.
That was their official theory, yes. But Thomas Hargrove and MAP immediately came back with a very powerful rebuttal.
Which was what?
That the absence of a single match doesn't disprove the serial killer theory at all. It just disproves the existence of a single sloppy serial killer who was already in the system.
So what's the independent theory that came from this DNA evidence?
The independent theory, which MAP supports, is that the forensic fragmentation actually proves the existence of multiple serial killers. Probably between 1 and 3 distinct pairful offenders who are operating at the same time, or one after the other.
And why would they not be in CODIS? And why did they leave so little DNA in the first place?
This is where the theory gets chilling. It suggests the killers are forensically aware.
What does that mean exactly?
It means they're taking precautions. They might be using condoms, wearing gloves, being careful not to scratch or bite the victim in a way that would leave their own skin cells behind. This level of learned caution, it argues against a disorganized amateur killer.
And it reinforces those community theories we talked about
It
earlier.
absolutely does. And we also have to stress the statistical limitation here. Analyzing only 21 samples out of a potential 51 cases. That sample size is just too small to say anything definitive about all 51 victims.
Right. There could be other killers hidden in the 30 cases that haven't even been tested.
For sure. And on top of all that, you have the massive systemic roadblock of the Illinois State Forensic Labs. The backlogs there were just incredible.
I remember reading about this. Delays of up to 30 years in some cases.
Yes. Due to chronic understaffing, underfunding, just a total breakdown. So even if a perfect DNA sample was collected from a victim in 2003, it might have just sat in a freezer unprocessed for decades.
Just delaying justice year after year. Before we move on, we have to talk about the one big suspect who brought this whole story into the national spotlight. Darren Dion Van.
Darren Dion Van, the so-called Gary Strangler, he was arrested in 2014 over in Indiana, which is right next door to Chicago.
And he was a prolific, confirmed serial killer.
Absolutely. Operating in the same region during the same time frame as the early part of this Chicago cluster. And crucially, when he was caught, he confessed to murdering women for decades. He specifically told investigators he'd committed way more murders in Chicago than they knew about.
So he is a very strong suspect for some of those early unlinked cases. Did his arrest in 2014 stop the killings in Chicago?
No. And that is the critical point. The killings continued after Van was in prison. That resurgence in 2017 and 2018 with victims like Diamond Turner and Rio Holyfield proves that Van isn't the only predator. He might be one of them, but his removal from the streets did not end the violence.
So we have the statistical certainty of multiple killers, we have fragmented DNA evidence, and we have this history of investigative incompetence going all the way back to the 90s.
But the biggest roadblock of all, for decades, wasn't forensic. It was institutional.
Right, which brings us to the core conflict. If the data so clearly points to multiple calculated killers preying on these vulnerable women, why was the official police stance one of denial for so long?
And that question points directly to a failure of institutional will, of prioritization. This official denial created a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed all of these community theories, trying to explain how a killer or killers could be so invincible.
And this mistrust wasn't just paranoia. It was based on real history.
It was founded on confirmed historical precedent in Chicago, which brings us to the first major rumor, the police officer theory.
The idea that the killer is or was a cop.
That's the one. It's a persistent rumor in the community, and the primary piece of evidence people point to is that extreme forensic awareness we just discussed.
The ability to commit such a violent, intimate crime and leave almost no DNA behind.
Right. It requires a level of training or learned caution that aligns with police procedure or maybe military training.
And this rumor is fueled by the very real, documented history of police corruption in Chicago.
Yes. The community's belief in this theory is amplified by things like the Operation Snake Doctor scandal.
Remind us what that was.
That was a scandal where multiple CPD officers were caught framing innocent men for murder just to clear cases off their books.
So if the department was proven to be capable of that, the community felt it was also capable of covering for one of its own.
Exactly. It reinforces the suspicion that the CPD could not only be negligent, but could actively cover for a rogue cop serial killer, especially one who was careful and targeted women the system already disregarded.
Okay, so that's one theory. The other major one pivots away from law enforcement and towards organized crime.
This is the theory of gang cleanup operations. It suggests that these aren't recreational killings by a serial predator, but are actually systematic executions ordered by drug gangs.
The goal being to silence sex workers or informants who know too much about their street operations.
Exactly. And this theory also provides a logical explanation for the professional lack of DNA. Organized crime figures would be highly sophisticated and experienced in operational security. They know how to commit a murder without leaving evidence.
So both of the dominant community theories, that it's a cop or that it's a gang hit, they both converge on the same point.
That the predator is not an amateur. They are forensically aware and they know how to operate under the radar in that specific high-crime environment.
It's all consistent. But let's also look at how the police themselves handled the data they did have. Critics have argued that the CPD used those inconclusive DNA results as a shield.
A deliberate shield to avoid acknowledging the size of the crisis and, causing a public panic.
How does that misinterpretation work? Inconclusive doesn't mean innocent?
No, it just means the lab couldn't generate a usable profile. The reality is that getting good touch DNA from a body that's been decomposing in an alley or a garbage bin is incredibly difficult. But activists claim the CPD chose to emphasize the fragmentation of the DNA over the statistical clustering of the cases,
To downplay the serial killer narrative and stick to their unconnected crimes theory.
which effectively prevented the resources and attention that would have come with a dedicated serial murder task force.
But perhaps the most damning finding of all when it comes to institutional failure came from the most recent governmental review.
Yes, the 2024-2025 Task Force Report on Missing and Murdered Chicago Women, it delivered a scathing structural condemnation of the CPD's methods.
What was the core problem they identified?
Deeply flawed data and a severe lack of transparency. But the mechanism of neglect was the real scandal. The report found that officers were routinely misclassifying missing persons cases.
How were they misclassifying them?
They were logging them as non-criminal incidents, or as simple check the well-being calls.
And what's the direct investigative consequence of doing that?
Yeah. If a woman from a vulnerable group goes missing and her case is logged as non-criminal, it prevents a serious missing persons file from ever being created. It artificially lowers the number of missing women, and it makes it almost impossible to connect that missing person to the murder victim they might later become.
It's systematically creating data gaps.
Mm.
It's obstructing the investigation before it can even begin.
The system itself was creating the conditions for these high-casualty, low-risk serial murders. By failing to prioritize the victims and by obscuring the true size of the crisis through these flawed data practices.
Which means the systemic failures didn't just miss the killer. They actively created the perfect hunting ground for him or them.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests.
The public outcry and the investigative pressure have finally, it seems, forced some real institutional changes in just the last couple of years.
Yes, the establishment of the task force on missing and murdered Chicago women is the most significant recent development.
And what were the big structural changes their 2025 report demanded?
The report went beyond just criticism. It demanded concrete policy changes. The most important recommendation was for the immediate creation of a dedicated missing persons unit.
Because right now, detectives are just split between too many different duties.
Exactly. They lack the specialized focus you need for these complex cases that link across different districts and span decades. A dedicated unit is the only way to end that pattern of misclassification and ensure that these cases get connected early on.
And while this systemic cluster of 51 cases remains unsolved, the community is constantly being reminded that the underlying threat is still very much active.
That's right. The strangulation of Sierra Jameson in 2023 was a stark reminder.
Now, her killer was caught, and her death hasn't been officially linked to the larger strangler cluster.
Correct. But her case just reignited all that community fear. It highlighted the ongoing, localized violence that is still targeting women in Chicago. As long as those 51+ cases remain unsolved, that predatory environment haven't really changed.
Okay, so if CODIS, the standard criminal DNA database, failed to get a match on any of the 21 samples they tested, what is the path forward? There has to be a way to use the forensic evidence they do have.
The future of this entire investigation hinges on one thing: adopting advanced forensic methods, specifically forensic genetic genealogy, FGG, using databases like GEDmatch.
This is the technology that's been solving all these famous cold cases, like the Golden State Killer.
It is, and it's the key piece of technology required to finally break down that forensic wall in Chicago.
Explain the difference. Why does FGG work when CODIS failed?
Okay, so CODIS is reactive. It can only match DNA to a profile of a known criminal who is already in the system. Since the Chicago Strangler profiles didn't get a match, it means the killers aren't in CODIS.
But FGG is proactive.
It's a proactive investigative tool. It lets investigators take those fragmented, unlinked DNA samples, the 18 to 21 profiles they do have, and upload them to commercial genealogy databases, the ones people use to find their ancestors.
And these databases contain DNA from regular citizens, not just criminals.
Right. And the upload doesn't identify the killer directly. What it does is identify distant relatives of the killer, a second cousin, a great aunt, who willingly uploaded their DNA for family tree research.
And from there, they can build out a massive family tree.
And by building that tree, they can narrow the suspect pool down from millions of people to a single family, often in a specific part of the country. It's the only known technology that can take those existing unlinked samples and generate new leads.
And it would finally allow investigators to start separating this massive 51-person cluster into the smaller, discrete sprees that the data suggests are really there.
That is the urgency. But the use of FGG remains a core conflict in Chicago.
Why? Why aren't they using it on every single one of these cases?
The CPD has been very slow to adopt it. There are concerns over privacy, the high cost of the genealogical research, then the legal hurdles of getting warrants for these kinds of familial searches.
So it's bureaucracy and budget standing in the way of solving these murders.
That's what it comes down to. And it creates this massive chasm between the community activists, the advocacy groups like the Chicago Missing Persons Guild and the Murder Accountability Project, and the official police stance.
The activists are basically just pushing the city to get over its own inertia to bring justice to these families.
That is the analysis. The forensics prove this isn't one big story. It's multiple distinct stories of calculated violence, all woven together by this thread of systemic neglect. And justice for these women, mothers, sisters, and daughters like Angela Ford, Diamond Turner, and Rio Holyfield, it depends entirely on the city finally prioritizing these cases and adopting the technology they need, regardless of the victims' backgrounds. So, to summarize the analysis of this 24-year crisis, the Chicago Strangler is an unsolved serial murder phenomenon. It involves at least 51 lives lost. And this crisis was enabled not by the genius of one supercriminal, but by persistent institutional bias, catastrophic failures in crime scene processing, and bureaucratic roadblocks that just crippled the forensic analysis.
And the evidence points conclusively to multiple serial killers, all exploiting a climate of institutional neglect.
The key takeaway has to be this. Justice for these families isn't about finding one single boogeyman. It's about solving the smaller, discrete serial sprees that are hidden inside this massive, daunting cluster.
And the city now has the data from MAP, it has the recommendations from the task force report, and the technology in FGG exists to finally begin that process.
So if you have any information about any unsolved female strangulation case on the south or west sides of Chicago since 2001, please contact the Chicago Police Department or the Chicago Missing Persons Guild. The key to solving these cases lies in community tips and the application of that new forensic technology.
The most haunting truth about the Chicago Strangler crisis is this. Until those systemic issues are fixed, the accurate classification of missing women, the elimination of the forensic backlog, and the decisive adoption of FGG technology Chicago remains a tragically low-risk environment for this type of calculated predator. Are there more names that have yet to be linked to this tragic 24-year tally? And are there killers still walking free because of the system's past failures? That is the question that must be answered now.
Don't forget to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime.
Like, share this episode with others who might have information about this case and help. Also, comment your suggestions below. Drop your positive review and rating.